The following true ghost story was reported to psychic researcher Maude in around 1930. A Mr. Edward Stewart of New York told her positively that the events definitely occurred, as he had been informed of them firsthand from the witness. Stewart's friend Walter had been one of a syndicate who rented out accommodation near rice swamps in Louisiana for a hunting party. Unfortunately, one day the group, with their two setters, became disoriented and wandered around for hours trying to find their direction. To make matters worse, the daylight was waning and they faced the prospect of a cold night without shelter. Eventually, they found themselves at the end of what had once been an avenue leading to a house. The hunters had to fight their way through fallen trees and overgrown vines and grasses to finally come across a long, low colonial house set high in a series of terraces and deserted lawns. Feeling heartened, the men followed a flagged path leading up to the portico of the house, however, finding shuttered windows and no response when they hammered on the door. They then made their way to the back of the house, where everything appeared derelict and abandoned. Walter then suddenly caught a glimpse of a twinkling light deep in the outbuildings. Following it, they found it to be a lamp in a rundown cabin from where an elderly African-American man emerged and questioned them about what they were doing there. On being told that the hunters were lost and needing a night's lodging, the man Jake initially refused to discuss the matter. He told them that there was no one in the house and that no one had lived there since the former owner, also that it was definitely not a good idea to sleep there. However, the hunters were soon able to negotiate a deal which was acceptable to Jake. He finally agreed to make a fire in the hall of the once fine southern mansion where the hunting party could sleep until morning. He also offered to provide the men with coffee and a meal during their night's stay. He led them back to the entrance and unlocked the massive stained mahogany doors, then the small party followed him inside. At which stage, a very strange thing occurred. The two large setters, who were well-trained dogs, suddenly ran ahead, then stiffened and growled. They darted left and right, circling nervously and violently shivering. Jake muttered that he wondered what was wrong with them, then suddenly seemed to remember something and shook his head ominously. Even the highly practical Walter later told Stewart that as soon as he crossed the threshold of the rotting house, he inexplicably felt uncomfortable and wished that he were outside again. Jake started the hall fire, and soon the men were resting in dilapidated armchairs, awaiting his return with the supper he had kindly offered to prepare. However, Walter felt restless and decided to venture up the wide staircase to have a look around. All the bedchambers were located around the upstairs gallery and were empty except for one which he was surprised to find almost fully furnished. It contained a large four-poster bed with tattered chintz hangings, a worn velvet-covered rocking chair and a dressing table with its tarnished mirror. On opening the shutters, Walter observed the moonlit landscape of trees and lawns and decided that this would be where he slept. He returned downstairs, where he found his friends enjoying drinks brought by Jake, who had obvious tears in his eyes. Jake explained that he was remembering events of the past, the family who had lived there before things went wrong. Walter simply asked that Jake prepare a fire in the upstairs bedroom with the four-poster, as he had decided to sleep there. Jake immediately tried to talk Walter out of separating from the other men, asking if he believed in hauntings. Walter replied that he certainly did not. Jake warned that if he saw anything frightening, not to blame him. Walter's friends were amused by this exchange, as he became even more determined to sleep upstairs. Eventually, the men settled down, wrapped in horse blankets provided by Jake, who proceeded up the staircase to start a fire in the chintz bedchamber. Walter then lay down in his blankets, using his coat as a pillow, and eventually dozed off. However, something was soon to snap him awake. The rocking chair beside the fire suddenly jerked backwards as if someone had just sat down, and it began to rock slowly to and fro. Walter stared as the chair continued to rock. Thinking that what he saw was some trick of the firelight, he got up and investigated. There was no sign of any movement, so now convinced that his eyes had deceived him, he returned to bed. Immediately, the rocking started again. After a few minutes of his shocked observation, the chair suddenly jerked backwards again, and Walter heard soft padding footsteps making their way across the room towards the window. Now completely awake and unnerved, Walter lay in dread of what was to happen next. The unseen presence was evidently standing by the window. Walter could hear the restless tapping of fingers against the panes as it seemed to become impatient. Described by his friend as no coward, Walter was completely unprepared for the horror that then materialised. The tapping ceased and was replaced by the unmistakable sound of a knife being slowly sharpened. He later remarked that all the hatred of the world seemed concentrated in this slow, deliberate sharpening. All at once, the figure of a huge, muscular man was standing in the shadows of the window. It was so lifelike and menacing that Walter at first believed it was real and that intruders had got into the house. He listened for other sounds in the house, but all was silent. Forcing himself to make eye contact with the African-American man, Walter immediately realised that he existed in a different reality, and also that he himself was about to witness a psychic tragedy once connected with this room. The large figure took a step towards the bed, then stopped as if listening for some movement from its occupant. Then, seemingly satisfied that his victim was asleep, he advanced with a terrible determination. The long blade of the knife was clearly visible in the dying firelight. Frozen with terror, Walter lay there watching the man before regaining his senses and springing out of bed shouting for help. Downstairs, his friends and the two dogs roused themselves and were soon by his side. Not wanting to appear cowardly, Walter claimed that a living person had entered the house and come into his room. Again, the two setters showed unmistakable terror and bolted down the stairs. The group of men scoured the property inside and out, but could find no one. Then all decided to see the night through lounging around the hall fire. Come morning, and the reliable Jake appeared accompanied by his grandson, both bearing breakfast trays. Walter immediately asked him who the man was who had come into his room the night before and done some knife sharpening. In shock and disbelief, Jake dropped the cup he was holding with a crash. He knew immediately the identity of the spectre. The enslaved man, called Pete, had drowned in the swamp more than 70 years ago, not before dispatching the slave owner in his sleep. Pete had acted as the so-called master's valet. One day, the brutal treatment he had received became too much for him, and after the slaying, he had fled up country. Pursued by the family's bloodhounds, he had run into a swamp and drowned. Now, no one but Pete was able to live in the house. The footnote to this account is that as the group left the house, Walter glanced back for one last look. Sure enough, he was certain that he could see Pete's face staring out at him through the upstairs window.